everyone in the US, in Europe, and Israel. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today Einat Wilf, Dr. Einat Wilf, who is the co-author of a very important book, which is called The War of Return. She co-authored with Adi Schwartz, a prominent journalist in Israel. Dr. Einat Wilf was a former member of the Knesset 10 years ago. She was also a lieutenant in Shmone Matem in Israel. She was born and raised in Israel, and she also studied, she did a part of her study in France. So Einat, I may have a few words in French for you, and it's our great pleasure welcoming you today to have this very important discussion because coming from the Labour Party, you have quite changed some views about the situation for the Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. And my first question to you is, how did you came to that change? Why do you think that Europe has not been helpful and made so many mistakes in this situation?
So first of all, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. The background was that growing up in Israel, in Jerusalem, in Beit HaKerem, I grew up really in a social labor political environment. And as a young adult in the 80s and 90s, I had the Labor Party views, which at the time were really focused on the land for peace formula for making peace. And this formula seemed to really work. This is how we made peace with Egypt, although we can have an interesting discussion as to whether we actually have peace with Egypt. But that was the basic formula. And this was the formula for the 1990s, for the negotiations with Syria over the Golan Heights, with the peace agreement with Jordan, when it gave up its territorial demands for the West Bank, and of course, for the negotiations with the Palestinians. And I, like many Israelis of the political left, had great hopes in the 90s, and especially when Ehud Barak went to Camp David, and we realized that he put on the table a very bold proposal for an end to the occupation. So a sovereign, independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, no settlement. They were either going to be dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land, capital in East Jerusalem. We thought peace was around the corner. I mean, Ehud Barak was operating based on the land for peace formula. He was checking all the boxes of what we were told that the Palestinians wanted. And all the Palestinians had to do was say yes. And what happened? Well, as you know, they walked away. They happened again with Abu Mazen and Ehud Olmert in 2008. He walked away from a similar proposal. And not only did they walk away, and not only was it followed by devastating violence, they were not criticized for walking away. And think about it, if a people want a state, if they want an end to the occupation, if they want no settlements, if they want East Jerusalem as their capital, all the things that we're still being told, certainly in Europe, that they're what needs to be for peace, if people really want that, and their leaders could have that, but they don't take that, you would expect, I don't know, one op-ed, some criticism, someone to say, hey, go back to the negotiating room and get us our state. But no, they did not face criticism, which means that in walking away from those proposals, they were carrying out their people's wishes. And this led Adi, who was a senior journalist and editor with Haaretz, and myself, to go back to the drawing table and basically ask what was wrong about our assumptions about the nature of the conflict, about what the Palestinians wanted. And we realized that the answer was hiding in plain sight. The Palestinians were telling us all along what they wanted. We just didn't listen. Or when we did listen, we didn't take them seriously. They told us, from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine will be free. I sometimes add in parentheses of Jews. They want an Arab Palestine. They've always wanted it. And the mechanism by which they believe they can still have it is this thing that they call the right of return. So like many Israelis, and I think my process is not unique in what happened to the Israeli left, is that we repeatedly were willing to offer the Palestinians everything we were told by people like the Europeans, that this is what the Palestinians want, only to realize that they want something else completely.
And how do you think, thank you very much, this is such a great resume of what happened over the years. How do you think your book was welcome in Europe?
So I can tell you how Adi and I have spent the last few years. I mean, the book came out in Hebrew a couple of years ago, and we've spent the last few years meeting numerous European diplomats and journalists. And why European? Because Europe, certainly now, since the United States stopped funding UNRWA, UNRWA being the UN agency that sustains for Palestinians the idea that they're still refugees, that one day they will have a mass return into the state of Israel. UNRWA is funded by Europe to more than $1 billion a year, first and foremost, of course, by the EU, but then by individual countries, Germany, UK, Sweden, France, Switzerland. And we meet with Europeans who are very invested in their support for UNRWA. And I have to share with you one such meeting we had about a year ago in Brussels. This was a German diplomat, but an EU diplomat, who works in Brussels on the funding of UNRWA. So really the person. Adi and I go with him through the story, through the fact that the Palestinians are really serious about return, that UNRWA has sustained them in their belief, that Europe, by funding UNRWA, actually fuels this Palestinian vision. And we go through that, we go through the history, and then at the end of an hour, he looks at us and he says it, I'm going to do it at the same pace that he said it. So you want to tell me that the reason we still don't have peace is that the Palestinians want all of it? And Adi and I go, yes! But we remember this process that for him, just to begin to process this idea was unthinkable. And because of that, and because of all these experiences, I've invented a word which I introduced in the book, and I call it West-plaining. I'm sure you all know by now the word mansplaining, when men say what women should think or just try to say. And West-plaining is the word I invented when European diplomats and journalists explain away what Palestinians have just said. So Palestinians will say, from the river to the sea, the right of return is holy. We'll never give it away. Israel is a foreign implant in the region. Blah, blah, blah. They say these things. To their credit, they say them. And then what do you hear from European diplomats? They know it's not going to happen. It's a delusion. They're angry. It's because what Netanyahu just said. And often we have to tell them, listen to them. Give them the respect of listening to them. They know what they want. They've been fighting for it for decades. They know what they're sacrificing for. Don't look down on them. They know what they want. And by the way, they're very rational about it. The notion that the right of return is a delusion and the Palestinians know it's not going to happen, there's no evidence for that. The evidence is the contrary. And all you have to do to understand why Palestinians are rational is to open a map. The Palestinians do that. They see 7 million Jews at best trying to survive among half a billion Arabs, 1.5 billion Muslims, and they say to themselves, this Zionist experiment is not going to last much longer. Ultimately, the region will revert to being Arab and Muslim, and Palestine from the river to the sea will be ours. All we have to do is wait one more generation, 3 more generations, and it will be ours. It's an entirely rational worldview.
Okay, and I have another question for you. I believe you were elected in 2010, and I believe that initially you were chairing the Education Committee, and you were also a member of the Foreign Commission. And I saw in your bio that you were initially a Labour member, and then you became independent. So after asking you, how was your book welcome in Europe, I'd like to ask, how was it welcome in Israel by your former colleague at the parliament? What did they thought about your change of view and opinion?
So the book in general in the Israeli left was received in 2 ways. For many, the book basically gave history and shape and understanding to their instinctive sense, which I described at the opening, that what the Palestinians want is all of it. I think the vast majority of Israelis on the left have gone through this process, which is why you don't have today in Israel almost political representation for people who think that the reason that we don't have peace is that Israel didn't try hard enough, that Israel didn't offer enough. That part of the Israeli left has generally been devastated, and those people who read our book found that our book gave the history, the background, the language, the understanding to what they instinctively realized in the last 20 years or even 30 years of failed negotiations with Palestinians. There is still a very, very, very small contingency that opposes the book, but they're very small, who basically think that the book kind of lets Israel get away with too much, and that yes, the book might historically be correct, but if Israel only tried a little more, we would meet a Palestinian partner who would say yes to a Palestinian state in part of the land and would be willing to forego this idea of return. But our argument with these people is that this is wishful thinking. They actually cannot bring any evidence. And over the years since the book came out, I've met with a lot of groups, Israelis, non-Israelis, who say, oh, you're generalizing. It can't be that all the Palestinians want this. You know, just like you have some Israelis that want all of the land, and yeah, you know, the same with Palestinians. And I always send those delegations to do homework. I tell them, you know what? There's nothing easier than proving me wrong. Go find a Palestinian who will openly speak to the fact that Palestinians are not refugees. That if you're born in Ramallah and you're 30 years old, you're not a refugee from Palestine. That they're not refugees, that they do not possess a right of return into Israel, and that the Palestinians should move on from this demand to focus on building a state next to Israel rather than focusing on changing Israel into a Palestinian state. I always tell them, find me one. They never come back. And really, it's easy to prove us wrong, and yet no one seems to be doing that.
Yeah, strong point. And I'm seeing in the chat room a few comments from our dear friends, attendees, and backers regarding what we're talking about when we are telling the Palestinians. Are we talking about the Palestinian people, their elected or so-called elected people? Can you elaborate a little bit more about the legitimacy of the political leader in Palestine and their ability to represent exactly the Palestinian people?
Yeah. So one of the things that our book goes really throughout the decades is, I think, put an end to the myth of the pragmatic, peace-loving, willing to compromise Palestinian people and the harsh leadership that hijacks their cause. If anything, sadly, it's the opposite. One of the things that we see throughout the history is the idea of return, the idea that every Palestinian is basically a refugee from Palestine through the generations. The idea that the establishment of Israel is a grave injustice unique to the Palestinian people, which could only be corrected by the disappearance of Israel. What we see is that this is the deepest ethos and identity of the Palestinian people. Long before they have a clear leadership, it is the Palestinian refugees who assassinate King Abdallah, who naturalizes them and wants to end the refugee situation, who prevent UNRWA from resettling any of them, who basically refuse any step that would indicate that the war of 1948 is over. It is the people themselves, the refugees themselves, who are deeply committed to the idea that the war of 1948 is open and that they are one day going to still win it through return. The leaders of the Palestinians are deeply committed to this ethos because there is nothing more important to Palestinians. This is the broadest consensus in Palestinian society. As I said, you only need to prove me wrong with one person. It is the broadest consensus and no one speaks against it. So Palestinian leaders who are willing to sometimes compromise, who are more pragmatic, understand that they have no wiggle room. They cannot maneuver a compromise when the deepest ethos of the Palestinians is from the river to the sea, which is why many of the arguments and recommendations in our book focus on the fact that getting to peace is not about getting a nicer leader for the Palestinians. It's far more difficult. It's about changing the fundamental identity of what it means to be a Palestinian. It's nothing less than that. It's only when the Palestinians move away from attaching their identity to the idea of return and perennial refugeedom can you even begin to hope to have a different leadership. And in the book, we bring, for example, very relevant for Europe, the case of the German refugees from Czechoslovakia, from Poland after World War II. They wanted return. They wanted Prussia back. They wanted the lands that became Western Poland back. They wanted the Sudeten back. Did anyone indulge them? Did any European government give them billions of dollars to set up an agency? No. And only after a generation, when they finally understood that no one is listening to them and no one has any empathy for their cause, did Willy Brandt finally emerge as a leader to tell the German refugees it's over. In the book, we actually say that what the day when a Palestinian leader will do a cut and paste on Willy Brandt's speech from 1970 after he made an agreement with Poland over the border, will know that the Palestinian people have finally come to terms with the fact that the war of 1948 is over, that the lands that they consider theirs are no longer theirs, and that they can move on to establish a state next to Israel, but not instead of Israel. We're not there yet.
So, Einat, the full title of your book is The War of Return and How the Western Indulgence to the Palestinian Dreams has obfuscated the path to peace. And I believe that when you write about the Western indulgence, you mean both Europe and the US. But for the last 2 years, at least, the last 3 years by now, there has been so many changes in the US. And can you elaborate a little bit more on the changes you've seen in the situation, thanks to the Trump administration very strong stance on this question?
Certainly. So a bit of background so we understand how long we've come. During the 20th century, of course, there's a lot of new states, new borders, partitions, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of refugees. The only reason that the Palestinians, unlike the Germans, Poles, Ukrainians, Hindus, Muslims, South Koreans, North Koreans, The reason that the Palestinians are indulged by the West to keep being refugees rather than moving on is that at that moment, because of the Cold War, because of Arab oil, the West doesn't want to anger the Arab world. And when the Arab world pretty much tells, at the time it's the US and the UK, it tells them, look, you made one mistake when you supported partition, you don't want to make another. UNRWA will remain open. So till today, UNRWA is a still temporary organization. And the Palestinian refugees are not going to be settled, which means the war of 1948 will remain open. And the West is willing to indulge that, thinking that, you know, it's a small price to pay. But it's really what it becomes like a mafia racket. It becomes a protection scheme. The West basically plays the Arab world so that the Arab world will not be angry at the West. Jump to the present. The Arab League is not the same unified force it was in the 50s. Oil is not what it was. There's no Cold War, so there's no concern that the Arab world will go to the Soviet bloc. So all the conditions that forced the Western world to indulge the Arab demand and the Palestinian desire to keep the war of 1948 open have disappeared. And I think what the Trump administration instinctively realized, I don't know, maybe they understand rackets and protection, they understood that the conditions have changed and that at this moment, there will be zero consequences for pulling out. And they were right. They pulled out and there were zero consequences. The only missed opportunity that we explain in the book is that it's a shame that the US didn't do more to explain to Europe that it should do the same. Instead, it became just a thing about Europe should pay more money, and indeed, especially Germany gave more money, and that was it. That ended the story, which is a shame because what we would have wanted to see is this domino effect of more and more countries saying, we're getting out of this racket also. I mean, why are we paying $1 billion a year for an agency that makes sure that there will never be peace? I mean, this is the thing. On the one side, European countries claim that they support peace by means of 2 states for 2 peoples. And on the other hand, they give $1 billion a year to the organization that will ensure that this will never happen. It literally makes no sense. So for us, this is still a missed opportunity, which we hope to correct with the help of people like you, to get Europeans to understand that they need to pull out of UNRWA too, because they need to help the Palestinians go through the process that the German refugees did, that to understand that the war is over. In the book, we have a very simple phrase. We said, if you want peace, the war must end, right? This is really basic. Well, the Palestinians still think that the war is not over, and no one has bothered to tell them that the war is over. So until they are clearly told by their European $1 billion a year funders that the war of 1948 is over, that they are not refugees, that they do not possess a right of return. In the book, we explain why it's not an internationally sanctioned right. Only then can they begin the process of changing their identity and their foundational ethos.
Okay, I have one last question, and then I will open the floor for the Q&A. What do you think will be the consequences of the Brexit? How do you see the situation of the English leaving the European Union, and what could be the impact on the UNRWA? Do you see any?
Unfortunately, still, sadly, one of our biggest problems in getting European nations and the EU to back out of UNRWA is sadly the Israeli security establishment. There was recently a documentary in Israel about the war in Lebanon, the security area that we spent 18 bloody years. And you know, the four mothers who got us out of it, and Ehud Barak, of course. But the amazing thing is that they interview all these high military officers who say, we were just stuck mentally. Every time we said to ourselves, we cannot afford to get out. You know, the present situation is better than the alternative. Until one day we got out, and that was it. And all of them say we should have done it much earlier. It's the same with UNRWA. The Israeli military establishment is stuck in this worldview that UNRWA is somehow a moderating force in the region. In the book, we show that if anything, it's a radicalizing force in the region that radicalizes Palestinians generation after generation to keep fighting for everything. So the problem is that after, you know, it's only someone like President Trump who basically told Israelis, I don't care. I'm getting my money out. But as soon as he did it, I'm sorry to say, Israeli officials went to Europe and said, please keep giving money. So what we hope is that there will be more leaders in Europe who will basically say to the Israeli security establishment, we're not listening to you. It makes no sense for us to keep paying, and we're not going to pay. They don't listen to the Israeli security establishment in other things. Why are they suddenly listening to them in this? So I don't know that Brexit itself is the issue. The UK is a major funder of UNRWA. We've met with members of parliament in the UK who are open and want to change it. But you really need sometimes people like President Trump who are willing to just break with old worldviews and say, I'm out of here, and nothing happens.
Yeah, maybe one last question. What do you think about the peace agreements that we had with the Emirates that was announced last week? And what could be its impact on the European vision of the Israeli-Palestinian situation?
So that's actually very exciting. I wrote a piece for The Telegraph in which I call this agreement an Arab first. It's not the first peace agreement, but it's the first one that feels like peace. As I'm sure you know, for Arabs, normalization is a much more important thing than peace. Peace means like we don't attack you, fine. But as you know, Jordan and Egypt have spent the last few decades making it clear that they're not friends to Israel. You know, they've had UN initiatives against Israel. They're not friends with us. They don't visit us. There's no cultural or economic cooperation. Egypt is the #1 producer and purveyor of anti-Semitic content to the Arab world. And then comes the UAE and has basically a normalization agreement. And tourism, and, you know, ever since just the announcement, we don't even yet have an agreement yet. My Twitter feed is full of Emiratis waving Israeli flags and singing Hatikva and really showing that they want to be our friends. And this matters because at the core of the conflict, and this goes back to the Palestinian issue, is the idea that Israel is foreign, that Israel doesn't belong. Israel is like the French in Algeria. Israel is like the Crusaders. Why is this at the core of the conflict? Because it basically means that ultimately we'll go away. If we're like the French in Algeria, we will leave. So the only way the conflict ends is when the Arab world finally stops viewing us as the French in Algeria or the Crusaders and views us as an indigenous people who have a history in the region and that actually belong here. And this is what the Emiratis are offering. And that's why it's a really big deal. And I think over time, it will have an impact on Europe, because especially if this gathers force, if you have other countries, I think it will be more difficult, not impossible, but it will be more difficult for Europeans to be holier than the Arab Pope, to be more against normalization, to be more against Israel than the Arabs themselves. And I think that could be the impact over time.